All right, let's get right into it. We're going to tackle a huge question that, believe it or not, affects almost everything you buy. How do we keep our markets fair? Is the economic game we're all playing actually on a level field? I mean, have you ever wondered why you've only got one, maybe two choices for your internet service? Or why it feels like one single online store has basically everything? Well, that's not just a coincidence. It all comes down to the structure of the market, and more importantly, the rules that are supposed to govern that game.
So let's think about it like a sports league. For any game to be fair, you've got to have rules, and you need a ref to enforce them, right? You can't just let one team become so powerful that nobody else even has a shot at competing. And believe it or not, economics works in pretty much the exact same way.
Now, this table breaks down the different leagues in our economic game. On one end, you have what's called perfect competition. That means tons of sellers, and it's super easy for new ones to jump in. Just picture a farmer's market, with dozens of different stalls selling tomatoes. But on the complete opposite end, you have a monopoly, just one seller calling all the shots. And somewhere in the middle is an oligopoly, where just a handful of big players control the whole field.
And this difference is absolutely crucial. In a really competitive market, it's the market itself that sets the price. You, the customer, actually have some power. No single farmer can just decide that tomatoes now cost $100. But in a monopoly, that one seller can pretty much set whatever price they want. And that's the core fight for regulators. They're trying to keep things as close to that competitive, fair ideal as possible.
Okay, so enough with the theory. Let's see how this plays out in the real world. We're going to zoom in on Nigeria, which back in 2019 decided its economic game needed a brand new rulebook and a much tougher referee.
So, this new rulebook was called the Federal Competition and Consumer Protection Act, or FCCPA for short. And one of its biggest moves was creating a new regulatory body. Think of them as the new league commissioner, called the Federal Competition and Consumer Protection Commission. Their whole job: keep the market competitive and protect people like you and me from any unfair plays.
So what was this new ref looking for exactly? Well, this slide lays it out. They're on the lookout for monopolies, trying to stop huge companies from just crushing their smaller competitors, and cracking down on sneaky stuff like price fixing. Oh, and a big one. They now get the final say on whether two giant companies can merge into one.
But here's the thing. Writing the rules is one thing, but actually putting them into practice, that's a whole other story. This quote points out a massive hiccup. The new law put a new ref in charge of mergers, but the ref wasn't on the field yet. It created this gap, a lacuna, where for a little while nobody was actually overseeing these huge business deals. It just goes to show how messy this stuff can be in the real world.
Okay, so if you're that referee, how do you actually know when a team is getting too powerful? You don't just guess, you use stats. And when it comes to market regulation, one of the key stats is something called the HHI.
The Herfindahl-Hirschman Index. I know, it sounds super technical, but the idea behind it is actually pretty simple. It's just a score that tells you how concentrated a market is. In other words, how much of the market is controlled by just a few big companies. A low score is good. That means lots of competition. A high score? That's a red flag that you're getting dangerously close to a monopoly.
So how do you get this number? It's basically a four-step process. First, you figure out all the companies playing in a market. Second, you get each company's market share percentage. Third, and this is the key part, you square each of those numbers. Now I square them, because it gives way more weight to the biggest players. A company with a 50% market share has a much bigger impact on the score than 5 companies with 10% each. Finally, you just add all those squared numbers up and boom, you've got your HHI score.
And here's where the rubber meets the road. Regulators, like the Department of Justice in the US, use these clear thresholds. If the score is under 1,500, things look good. It's a competitive market. If it's between 1,500 and 2,500, they start paying close attention. But if it goes over 2,500, that's when the alarm bells start ringing. And any merger that pushes a market into that highly concentrated zone is going to get a very close look.
Okay, so the HHI seems pretty straightforward, right? A nice, clean number. Well, here's the twist. That number, that seemingly objective stat, can have a huge flaw. It can be totally misleading if you're not careful. Because the entire calculation, the whole thing, hinges on one very tricky question. What exactly is the market that you're measuring? Because how you answer that can completely change the story the numbers tell you.
Let me give you a perfect example. A local movie theater might have 90% of the movie theater market, and based on the HHI, that looks like a monopoly, right? But hold on, is that the real market? People are just trying to decide what to do on a Friday night. When you realize that cinema is also competing with Netflix at home, with bars, with restaurants, suddenly its real market power looks a lot smaller.
And this problem just pops up everywhere. How do you define the product? You could say a bank is competitive if you lump all financial services together, but what if it has a total monopoly on just basic checking accounts in a small town? And what about geography? A company could have a tiny 5% share of the national market, but if it's the only game in town in 5 different cities, well, it's a monopoly in those places. So the bottom line is this: the stats are only as good as the definitions you start with.
And all of this whole debate about how to define a market, it's pointing to an even bigger, more fundamental challenge. The rules and the stats we've been using, like the HHI, were basically built for a 20th century economy. But today, we're playing a completely new game, one that's dominated by digital platforms and networks.
And the key rule in this new game is something called network effects. It's this incredibly powerful idea that some things actually get better and more valuable the more people use them. Think about it. A telephone is pretty useless if you're the only person who has one, right? A social media platform is only fun because all your friends are already on it. That's a network effect.
This creates a completely different kind of industry. For a long time, regulators were used to dealing with natural monopolies, like the power grid. They get cheaper to run as they get bigger because the initial setup costs are so high. But a modern network industry, like a credit card company or a social media site, gets more valuable to every single user as it gets bigger. The value isn't just in being efficient, the value is the network itself.
And this is a massive headache for regulators. In the old world, a big merger that increased concentration was almost always seen as bad for consumers. But in a network industry, what happens if 2 ride-sharing apps merge? The HHI score would flash bright red, warning of a monopoly. But for the users, a bigger network might mean more drivers and shorter wait times. It completely messes with the old rules. Suddenly, bigger isn't automatically bad, it might actually be better for us.
Which leaves us with this final, massive question. The old rulebook was written for a game played on a physical field. Today's game is being played on digital networks, where the very definition of value and competition has changed. So as we look to the future, the biggest challenge of all might be just figuring out, what does a fair game even look like anymore?